So it's the 1st of March and time to look at another Mannequin of the month. A bit of a change of flavour here. Not only is this a different time period, we're looking at the 19th century, but also naval service as opposed to land-based. The uniform we have here represents a second-class petty officer of the Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers. We'll go to a little bit of unit history before looking at the uniform itself. The Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers were formed by Act of Parliament in 1873, and the unit was finally disbanded in 1892, so it spans the latter third of the 19th century, basically. The land-based volunteer force had been a great success, raising units to basically perform home defence in time of war, and the Navy wanted to capitalise on this and basically draw on the Victorian middle classes. And so the Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers were formed with the hope that it would recruit from those who had maritime pastimes, yachting, boating and so forth. The duties envisaged were basically manning coastal floating batteries for coast defence and gunboats, again in time of war. The unit was basically uniformed along the lines of the Royal Navy at the time, and what we have here is a frock, which is the basic working uniform of the Royal Navy at this time, or second best uniform as well. Starting at the top and working down, we'll have a look at this here, which is the soft Victorian naval cap. You can see it's a soft crown. Can be worn with a white cover in the summer months. Next on this we have the cap tally, which is obviously lettered R.N.A.V for Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers, and this is embroidered in silver. We have a crown surmounted by an anchor in the middle there. And the silver embroidery is important because the volunteer force on land had adopted silver metalwork and badges to differentiate it from the gold and brass of the army, the regular army. And the Naval Artillery Volunteers did the same thing to differentiate from the Royal Navy proper, whose full dress badges were embroidered in gold. The same goes true for officers. Buttons and lace and so forth was in silver to differentiate from the pucker service. Moving down, we have a white flannel, wool flannel underneath here, which is basically a short-sleeved undergarment, bound at the neck with blue jean tape. Next we have the seaman's collar, and this is another differentiating aspect of the uniform from the Royal Navy proper. We'll have a look at this in closer detail a little bit later on in the video. Rather than the white tapes being sewn on straight, they're in fact waved, and this pattern of waved lace would actually be perpetuated in later on by the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, whose officers wore waved lace on the cuff as opposed to straight bands of gold lace. Moving further down, we have the silk, and this is worn very wide. Silks, which are still worn as part of the Royal Navy dress uniform today, are pressed to 2 inches wide, I think, if I remember correctly. But at this time they were worn wide and not really folded tight, worn quite voluminously. We have the lanyard here, and at this time period the lanyard wasn't just an item of dress uniform, it was used for a practical purpose, which is to hold the sailor's clasp knife, which would be tucked into an inside pocket. Underneath we can see here cords, and these are used to tie the silk in a bight here. Later, and in some uniforms of the time, you see tapes being worn, wider tapes, but photographs of the time show many men just had simple cords to hold the silk together in a bight at the neck there. The frock itself is quite baggy, or would be on me. The mannequin's a little bit bigger than I am, but they were worn baggy and in fact tucked in, so you're not seeing the full aspect of the way this was worn here. But the bell bottoms would be worn outside, so would come up to about here, and the frock would be bloused over. Jumpers, which were more of a working garment, were worn untucked, and it's these that would be perpetuated later on when the frock was discontinued. Interestingly, a little bit of trivia, Royal Yacht crews, until Britannia was, of course, decommissioned, continued to wear their jumpers tucked in pastiche of this old practice of wearing the frock tucked in. Badges are another differentiating feature to some degree from the Royal Navy. If I pull this round here and rotate around, you can see here badge of a second class petty officer. The badge itself in design is the same as that worn by Royal Navy second class petty officers, but is in silver embroidery. On the frock, the Royal Navy wore red embroidered badges. On the dress jacket, they wore gold at the time period. The Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers were allowed to wear white or silver, so the equivalent of gold on the frock, with the Royal Navy weren't. So there was a choice there. On the frock, this could equally have been done in white embroidery as opposed to silver metal embroidery. We move this around the other side, we have on the right cuff 2 chevrons, and this is a badge peculiar to the Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers. It's not a Royal Navy badge, but it does show a Royal Navy qualification, which is that of trained man. So if you'd passed the Royal Navy qualifying criteria for trained man as a member of the Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers, that was recognised by wearing 2 silver chevrons point up on the right cuff. So that's a basic look at the overview of the uniform. As I say, it's essentially Royal Navy uniform at the time, with the differences that I've mentioned to indicate Royal Naval Artillery Volunteer service. We'll take a look at the details of the uniform now, close up, and here you can see the silver embroidered cap tally. Here you can see a close-up of the seaman's collar, and it shows more clearly the waved white tapes. Here you can see the substantive rate badge for a second-class petty officer in this time period. The rate had first been introduced in 1827 when it was represented by the fouled anchor alone. Then in 1853, the new rate of leading seaman was introduced, which took over the use of the anchor, so second-class petty officers gained a crown above the anchor to differentiate them. The rate existed until 1913, when it was abolished, and all petty officers from that point on would be included under one grade. Looking at the right cuff, we can see the 2 silver chevrons, which represent a trained man who's passed for the trained man qualification used in the Royal Navy. A single chevron would represent proficiency for 1 year, with stars being used subsequent to this to show proficiency. So obviously most of this is reproduction. So I will run through the bits and pieces of this and how I've put it together and where the bits came from. The cap is actually a US naval cap. The US Navy never introduced the stiff cap like the Royal Navy did later on, and used the soft cap all the way through. Of course, then the Dixie Cup, the white working cap, became the standard headdress. But this is very similar to that worn by the Royal Navy during the Victorian era. The cap tally is from a company called Saw Valley Weaving, who produce custom cap tallies. It's a modern reproduction, but accurate to the originals. And it was a custom order from them. That was very kind of them to do that. The collar is something I've modified myself. I believe it's Second War, possibly handmade, I'm not sure. But it wasn't in, the tapes were already becoming unpicked when I got it, so I decided to unpick them entirely and sew them back on in the waved lines for use with this uniform. The white flannel, the wool flannel, is a reproduction made by a seamstress called Jo Lawler, who also works for the Royal Navy Museum. Very kind, made to a First World War pattern, which, as I say, I'm not sure is entirely accurate for Victorian, but for what you see here at the neck, it's fine for being on the mannequin. The silk, I believe, is a form of martial arts belt. A friend of mine bought several of these. I think it's a synthetic silk, but nevertheless looks fine for use on the mannequin. It's the right width, which is the nice thing, and allows you to get this look of having the big sort of shock of silk on each side of the collar, which is very distinctive from Victorian naval uniforms. The lanyard is just a modern Royal Navy lanyard. There's nothing special about that. They haven't really changed. And then underneath the cords I added on myself is just a piece of shoelace, a cotton shoelace. As I say, it could also have tapes like was later done where you can tie a nice bow. That's also seen at the time. But at this time period, a lot of uniforms were still being handmade or tailor-made, so there was some variation, which is something the Admiralty would try and clamp down on in the 1890s, because there was still a lot of variation between uniforms. The frock itself is from Civil War sutlers, and it's a reproduction intended for Union Navy use, for reenactors of the Union Navy during the American Civil War. But it is pretty much spot on for Royal Navy patterns of the time. You have the seam across the front here, and on the arms, I don't know if you'll be able to see this in the light, but the arm seam is down here, the shoulder seam is down here, not up on the shoulder, which again is accurate for the time period. It's one reason that the rate badges are worn so low down on the sleeve, is because of where the shoulder seam is. One thing I did do with this, it came with white metal buttons at the cuff, and I've replaced them with real black horn buttons at the cuff, which is more typical for Royal Navy use. The badges themselves are homemade or home modified. Looking again at the rate, the substantive rate badge, the crown is from a separate badge stitched on and then cut into the tombstone shape. Basically I modified these with silver paint, and it's been surprisingly effective. Another thing I did was to fill the voids in the crown with maroon or burgundy embroidery thread, because it's more typical of the time, badges of the time. On the other hand, this here is custom made. I just stitched some silver lace onto a piece of blue backing cloth and then stitched onto the uniform. So that's a homemade badge, the two chevrons on the cuff there. So that's pretty much it. I hope you found that interesting. It's a little bit different from my other videos I've done so far, but I thought that would possibly be refreshing. If it's not your cup of tea, then maybe the next mannequin will be. If you enjoy my content and would like to see more, then please consider subscribing. And obviously, if you've already subscribed or if you're newly subscribing, make sure you hit the notification button so you know when I upload future videos. There'll be more photographs of this on the Facebook page, and I'll put some up on Instagram as well. Check out those. There's links in the description. And that's it for now. So until next time, bye for now.